The Hollywood sun was dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows over the bustling streets of Los Angeles. The city, usually so full of vibrance and glamour, was wrapped in a strange air of discomfort on that particular evening. As the warm golden hues of the sunset slowly faded into night, something darker was brewing in the heart of the film industry, far removed from the soft glamour of movie stars and their glossy facades. Inside a lavishly furnished office on the back lot of a prominent studio, Charles Westbrook, the renowned film producer, sat hunched over his desk. He had been working late, his weary eyes scanning the papers strewn across the polished surface. Westbrook had been a titan in Hollywood for years, responsible for some of the biggest hits in cinematic history. However, his rise to power had been marked by ruthless decisions and an unyielding desire to control every aspect of his productions, often leaving a trail of enemies in his wake. This evening, though, something was different. The papers before him were not filled with the usual scripts and contracts. They were far more sinister, threatening letters, cryptic messages that hinted at dark secrets he had long kept hidden. They spoke of betrayal, of blackmail, and of a reckoning that was about to come for him. As he leaned back in his chair, trying to steady his breath, a knock echoed from the door. Westbrook frowned, his thoughts interrupted. The studio had long since closed for the night, and he had no desire to entertain anyone, least of all those with whom he had been feuding in recent months. "Come in," he called out gruffly. The door opened with a soft creak, and in stepped a woman dressed in an evening gown that shimmered with every movement. Veronica Hart, the rising star of Hollywood, stood there, her face a mask of charm and mystery. She had been one of Westbrook's protégés, an actress whose career he had nurtured carefully. But there had always been something unsettling about her, a calculated air behind her doe-like eyes, a demeanor that suggested she wasn't just playing the part of a sweet ingenue. "Mr. Westbrook," she said softly, closing the door behind her, "I hope I'm not disturbing you." Westbrook barely spared her a glance, his eyes once again fixed on the threatening letters. "What is it, Veronica?" She took a few steps toward the desk, gliding gracefully in her heels. "I thought we should talk. About the film, about your plans." "There are rumors, you know." She paused, her gaze lingering on him. "There are whispers that you intend to change the script again, that you might take it in a direction that none of us are prepared for." He grunted, unwilling to meet her gaze. "I'll do what I want with my own production, thank you." His tone was sharp, and he was in no mood for her games. But Veronica was nothing if not persistent. "I'm afraid you're playing a dangerous game, Mr. Westbrook," she continued, her voice low, almost conspiratorial. "You've made a lot of enemies lately, and some of them, they're very close to you." Westbrook finally looked up, his eyes narrowing. "What are you talking about?" His voice was low, almost threatening. Veronica stepped closer, her gaze never leaving his. "You know exactly what I mean. People like me, we aren't just in this industry because we're talented. We have connections, Mr. Westbrook, we know things. And sometimes the people you think you can trust are the ones who will stab you in the back." For a moment, Westbrook said nothing. He stared at her, assessing her words. Veronica had been right about one thing. The walls were closing in on him. The dark secrets of his past were coming to the surface, and he knew it was only a matter of time before the truth would be exposed. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the phone ringing. He reached for it, but before he could answer, the door burst open once again. This time it was one of Westbrook's closest confidants, George Ackerman, a man who had worked with him for years. He was pale, his face drawn with an unusual expression of fear. "Mr. Westbrook," George began, his voice trembling slightly, "you need to come quickly. There's been an accident at the studio. We can't find the film reels for the new project, and I think someone might have taken them." Westbrook's face hardened. He knew instantly that this wasn't just a simple mistake or coincidence. Someone was playing a game with him, one that was far more dangerous than he had imagined. He stood up, his mind already racing through the possibilities. "Show me," he commanded, his tone cold. But as he moved toward the door, Veronica spoke once more, her voice eerily calm. "You'll want to be careful, Mr. Westbrook. There's more at stake here than just your career." Westbrook turned to look at her, his eyes now filled with suspicion. "What are you saying?" She gave him a knowing look. "You should have listened, Mr. Westbrook. Now it's too late." With that, Veronica turned on her heel and left the office, leaving Westbrook with a growing sense of unease. His hand gripped the doorknob tightly as he followed George to the studio. But the feeling that something irreversible had already begun to unfold gnawed at him. By the time they reached the back lot, Westbrook knew it was not just a matter of missing reels. The studio was eerily silent, far too quiet for such a late hour. George led him to the storage area, where the reels were kept. But as they turned the corner, Westbrook's breath caught in his throat. There, sprawled on the cold concrete floor, was the lifeless body of one of his assistants, Tom Reynolds. His face was twisted in terror, and the scene was one of complete chaos. Papers were scattered everywhere, and a few reels of film lay abandoned nearby. The sight of the body made Westbrook's heart race. He knelt beside the body, his mind reeling. The assistant had been a loyal employee, someone who would never have crossed him. Yet here he was, dead, a victim of something far more sinister than a simple accident. "What happened here?" Westbrook demanded, looking to George for an explanation. But the man only shook his head in confusion. Before George could answer, there was a faint sound behind them, a rustling, as if someone was moving in the shadows. Westbrook's instincts kicked in and he reached for the gun in his pocket, his eyes scanning the area. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice demanding an answer. But there was no response. Only silence. And then suddenly a scream echoed from the far end of the studio. The scream shattered the tense silence, its piercing intensity sending a chill down Westbrook's spine. Without thinking, his hand tightened around the gun and his eyes darted to the shadows. George, who had been frozen in place, looked back at him with a mixture of confusion and fear. Neither of them moved. Then, another scream echoed, closer now, coming from deeper within the studio. "Stay here," Westbrook whispered urgently to George, his voice low but firm. His hand trembled slightly as he gripped the gun. He had no idea who or what was responsible for the scream, but he knew it was time to face whatever nightmare had been unleashed in his studio. Slowly, Westbrook crept toward the sound, his footsteps cautious but steady. The shadows around him seemed to stretch and shift, casting an eerie, almost surreal quality over the backlot. The studio, usually a hive of activity, now seemed deserted, its massive walls towering over him in an oppressive silence. As he approached the source of the scream, the faint smell of cigarette smoke mingled with the heavy scent of freshly spilled blood. He rounded the corner, gun raised, heart pounding. What he found left him momentarily stunned. A woman was standing there, her back to him. She was dressed in a costume from one of the studio's latest films, a strikingly glamorous gown that shimmered under the flickering lights of the dimly lit corridor. She was shaking, her hands pressed to her face, her breathing quick and shallow. But what struck Westbrook most was her hair, the dark, wild tangles falling over her shoulders like an untamed mane. It was Veronica Hart, but this time she was not the poised, controlled actress he knew. She looked completely unhinged. "Veronica?" Westbrook's voice was strained, almost hesitant. "What happened?" She slowly turned to face him, her eyes wide and wild, filled with a frantic fear that he had never seen before. Her lips parted as if she was about to speak, but all that came out was a barely audible whisper. He's dead, Charles. He's really dead." Westbrook's heart sank. His gaze immediately snapped to the lifeless body at her feet. Another assistant, one who had been working late alongside Tom Reynolds. The assistant's name escaped him for a moment, but the pale face and the unnatural angle of the body were unmistakable. Blood pooled around the man's neck, staining the floor with a dark, sticky sheen. "Who did this?" Westbrook demanded, his voice tight with fury and confusion. He didn't need to ask if she was involved. The fear in her eyes told him all he needed to know. "I don't know," Veronica cried, her voice rising. She stepped back, almost stumbling, her eyes darting around the dim room. "I came to check on the reels. I heard someone was looking for them, and I found him like this, just like Tom." Westbrook couldn't keep the suspicion from creeping into his thoughts. Veronica had been the one to warn him, to suggest that people were coming for him, that enemies lurked in every corner. But how much of what she said was true, and how much was she hiding? "Stay here," he ordered, his mind racing. "I need to find out what happened." Veronica nodded, though she seemed too shaken to make any attempt to argue. Westbrook left her standing in the shadows, her eyes glued to the dead man at her feet. He moved quickly, his every step bringing him closer to the heart of the mystery. He had to know who was behind this, who wanted him dead, who had dared to destroy his empire piece by piece. He was about to step into the next corridor when a figure emerged from the shadows, moving with a silent grace that sent a shiver down his spine. It was George. I heard the screams, George said, his voice strained. He looked at the body, his eyes wide. What the hell is going on, Charles? Westbrook didn't answer right away. His mind was still spinning, trying to process the fact that two bodies had appeared out of nowhere, both assistants who had worked closely with him. And Veronica's frantic behavior added to the ever-growing list of unanswered questions. We need to get out of here, Westbrook finally muttered. We can't do anything more tonight. George hesitated, glancing nervously at Veronica, who was still standing alone by the body. What about her? He asked, nodding toward the actress. Do you think she's involved? Westbrook's gaze hardened. I don't know, but we'll find out soon enough. They made their way back to the office, the darkness of the studio seeming to press in on them from every side. When they finally reached the relative safety of the main building, Westbrook felt the weight of the situation settle on him like a suffocating fog. His empire was unraveling before his very eyes, and the truth felt like it was slipping just out of reach. You'll need to call the police, George said as they reached the office, his voice low. They'll want to know what happened. This is beyond us. Westbrook stared at the phone in his hand, the thought of involving the authorities making his stomach turn. But George was right. There was no other option. As he picked up the phone to make the call, his mind raced back to the words Veronica had said earlier. People like me. We aren't just in this industry because we're talented. We have connections, Mr. Westbrook. We know things. Was this some sort of elaborate game? One in which everyone he trusted had played their part? Or was he simply a pawn in a much larger scheme, one he hadn't even begun to comprehend? His thoughts were interrupted by the voice on the other end of the line. Detective Graves here. What's your emergency? Westbrook took a deep breath. This is Charles Westbrook, the producer. There's been a double murder at my studio. Meanwhile, in the shadows of the night, the stage was being set for an investigation that would rock Hollywood to its core. The phone call had barely ended when Westbrook turned toward George and, for the first time since the madness began, truly spoke his mind. They'll be here soon, he said, his voice steady but laced with a touch of something darker. We're not going to wait for them to figure this out. I'm going to find the truth myself. George looked at him, his expression both shocked and worried. Charles, what are you saying? I'm saying that whoever is behind this isn't done yet, Westbrook muttered, his eyes hardening. And I'm going to make sure they regret it. Before George could respond, Westbrook grabbed his coat and headed for the door, determination flashing in his eyes. The investigation would start tonight, no matter what it took. Someone had murdered two of his employees and sent a clear message, and he wasn't about to let them get away with it. As the door closed behind him, a cold wind blew through the backlot, carrying with it the scent of danger and the promise of a game that was far from over. And with that, Westbrook entered into a world he had never fully understood. A world where nothing, not even the glittering streets of Hollywood, was as it seemed. The night was suffocating, and the studio lot, which once thrived with the laughter of stars and the hum of creative energy, now lay eerily still. Westbrook walked with purpose, each step heavy with the weight of his decisions. The phone call to Detective Graves had barely ended before he was already on his way out of the office, moving swiftly down the narrow hallways of the studio toward the main exit. George, who had been trailing behind, seemed to hesitate before following. Charles, wait, George called out, catching up with him. What are you planning to do? Westbrook didn't break stride. His mind was already miles ahead of the present moment. I'm going to the scene. I need to see it again, every corner, every shadow. There's something we're missing. George frowned, his brow furrowed with worry. You're not trained to handle a crime scene. The police are on their way. I don't trust them, Westbrook snapped, his voice sharper than he intended. Not yet, at least. There's something in all of this that doesn't make sense, George. Too many things are off, and if I wait for the police, I'll lose any chance of solving this on my own. George opened his mouth to argue, but Westbrook was already moving faster, pushing open the door that led outside. The cool night air hit his face, but it did little to calm the rising tide of panic inside him. He had spent years building this empire, controlling every aspect of his business, and yet here he was, helpless in the face of something he couldn't understand. He felt as if the world he had so carefully crafted was crumbling around him, and the pieces of it seemed to be falling into places that made no sense at all. The backlot, Usually a lively maze of sets and props felt like a desolate graveyard at this hour. The distant sound of cars passing on the main road did little to fill the silence that hung heavily in the air. Westbrook took a breath and moved forward, his eyes scanning the darkened corners of the studio lot. George followed reluctantly, his footsteps echoing behind him. They reached the area where Tom Reynolds and the second assistant had been found. The scene was just as they had left it, stark, unnatural, and far too quiet. The bloodstains still soaked into the concrete, and the bodies had been removed, leaving only the smudge of death in their wake. Westbrook stood motionless, staring at the spot where they had fallen. "I don't understand," he muttered, more to himself than to George. "These men were loyal to me. They were my team. Why would anyone kill them?" George stood by his side, his expression somber. "Maybe it's not personal, Charles. Maybe this was just about the film. The reels. Whoever's behind this, maybe they wanted to make sure you couldn't finish it." Westbrook's eyes darkened. "I've made enemies, yes, but not like this. Not like this." He bent down, carefully inspecting the ground where Reynolds and the other assistant had been found. His eyes flicked over the area, seeking out something, anything that might give him a lead. His gaze landed on a small, twisted piece of metal, half buried in the blood-stained concrete. He crouched lower, picking it up carefully between his fingers. It was a small object, round and worn like a button or a coin, but Westbrook had no idea what it could be. He pocketed it, his mind already working on the puzzle. "Whoever's behind this is methodical," he murmured, standing up. "They've left nothing to chance. It's not just about the film. This is about something much bigger." George looked around nervously, as though the very shadows might hold more secrets. "You really think this is bigger than just a robbery gone wrong?" Westbrook didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stood still, his mind running through the possibilities. What if this wasn't about the studio at all? What if it was about something else? Something far darker, something that reached beyond the glitz of Hollywood and into a realm that most people only dared to glimpse in their nightmares. The sound of a car engine broke his reverie, and he turned sharply, instinctively reaching for his pocket. But it was only Detective Graves's car, pulling up slowly near the entrance to the studio lot. The detective, a tall, thin man with a stoic face and a perpetually furrowed brow, stepped out of the vehicle and surveyed the scene. "Mr. Westbrook," he greeted with a nod, though there was a hint of weariness in his voice. "You're here earlier than I expected." "I didn't have much choice," Westbrook replied tersely, still scanning the dark studio lot. "I need to understand what happened here, Detective. And I need to understand now." Graves's eyes flicked to the spot where the bodies had been found. "We're still gathering evidence, but I can tell you this much. We've got a double homicide on our hands. Someone didn't just kill these men. They made sure it was as messy as possible. I'm assuming you're already aware of the circumstances surrounding the murder." Westbrook nodded, though his mind was already working on another train of thought. "Someone is sending me a message. I just need to figure out who and why." Graves was silent for a moment, his gaze piercing through Westbrook. "What makes you think this isn't just a robbery? Or some kind of business deal gone wrong?" Westbrook was quiet for a long moment. "It's not about the money. It's about control. Whoever's behind this has a personal vendetta against me, not just my studio. I've made enemies, Detective, but this feels like more than just a typical threat." Graves narrowed his eyes, clearly skeptical but unwilling to push further for the moment. "Well, whatever the reason, we'll get to the bottom of it. The police will handle this from here. I suggest you stay out of it, Mr. Westbrook." "I can't do that," Westbrook replied, his voice firm. "This is my business, my life. I won't let someone destroy everything I've worked for." Graves looked at him for a moment longer, as if weighing his options, before sighing and walking toward the scene of the crime. "Suit yourself. But just remember, Mr. Westbrook, you don't get to play detective. That's my job." As the detective moved off, Westbrook stayed behind, his mind still whirling. He needed more than just police involvement in this case. He needed answers, and the answers were somewhere within this very studio. He was certain of it. His eyes scanned the studio lot once more, and that's when he saw it. Just beyond the rows of stage lights and sound equipment, a figure moving in the shadows. Westbrook's pulse quickened. Was it another member of his team? Someone who had slipped unnoticed into the building? Or was it someone else entirely? Someone involved in the deadly game that was now unfolding? Without thinking, Westbrook began walking toward the figure, his footsteps silent as he moved with purpose. Whoever it was, they were about to be a part of the answer he was desperately seeking. He rounded a corner and found himself face to face with a familiar figure. It was Veronica. She was standing alone by the edge of a set, her face obscured by the dim light. But Westbrook could see the anxiety in her posture. She wasn't alone, though. Behind her stood a tall, thin man in a dark suit, someone Westbrook didn't recognize. "Veronica," he said, his voice tight. "What are you doing here?" Veronica turned to him slowly, a faint forced smile on her lips. "I came to see if you were all right. You've been under so much pressure lately. I thought I could help." Westbrook's suspicion flared, but he kept his tone measured. "Who's that with you?" The man in the suit stepped forward, his eyes dark and unreadable. "My name is Lucas Darnell. I work with Veronica." "And what exactly do you do, Mr. Darnell?" Westbrook asked, his voice cool, though his mind was already racing. Darnell didn't answer immediately. Instead, his gaze flicked to Veronica before settling back on Westbrook. "I'm just here to make sure Veronica's interests are protected." Westbrook's mind clicked into place. Veronica Hart, the rising star, the actress with the ambition to climb higher than anyone could have expected. And now she was involved in something far bigger than the silver screen. "Interests?" Westbrook asked, his voice thick with suspicion. "What kind of interests?" Veronica hesitated, then stepped forward, her eyes flickering nervously. "Charles, I'm not the enemy here. But you need to be careful. All of this. It's bigger than you think. The people you've made enemies with, they won't stop until they've taken everything from you." Westbrook stared at her, a cold realization beginning to form in his mind. "What are you telling me?" She didn't answer, but the look in her eyes said everything. Westbrook felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end as the shadow of the killer loomed closer, pulling him further into the game. The danger was no longer distant. It had come to his doorstep. The pieces were all falling into place, but what Westbrook didn't know yet was that the real game was just about to begin. And this time it wouldn't be the victims who suffered the most. It would be him. The tension in the air was palpable, every word spoken between Westbrook, Veronica, and Lucas carrying the weight of unsaid truths. Veronica's expression had shifted from anxious concern to something else, something far darker. Her gaze never left Westbrook, and the silence between them hung like a thick fog, suffocating the conversation. "Veronica," Westbrook finally said, his voice low and measured. "You can stop pretending. You're not here just to help. What's going on? Who's behind this?" Her eyes darted to Lucas for a moment as though seeking approval. Then she slowly exhaled, almost as if releasing a breath she had been holding for too long. "I didn't want to drag you into this, Charles," she murmured, her voice tight. "But now you're already in it." Westbrook stepped closer, his gaze sharp. "You're not making sense. I need you to be clear. Who's behind the murders? Who wants me gone?" Veronica hesitated, visibly battling with herself before she took a step forward. "You know Hollywood, Charles. You know how much power and money are involved in this industry. But some people, some very powerful people, don't want the truth to come out, and they'll do anything to keep it buried." The cold realization began to settle in his chest. There were things in Hollywood that remained hidden beneath layers of glamour and lies. But now the ugliness of those secrets had come knocking at his door. Westbrook's empire had always been built on control, manipulation, and the art of negotiation. But even he couldn't ignore the fact that there were forces at work that were far beyond his reach. This wasn't just a business deal gone wrong. This was personal. "You're talking in circles, Veronica," Westbrook said, his patience thinning. "Who are these people?" She glanced at Lucas again, and this time he stepped forward, his cold eyes meeting Westbrook's with an unreadable expression. "We're talking about people with money, connections, and the kind of power that doesn't care about the law or your reputation. You've heard of the name Warren Blackstone, haven't you?" Westbrook's stomach churned at the mention of the name. Blackstone was a shadow in Hollywood, a producer whose influence stretched far beyond the realm of the public eye. His projects were notorious for being shrouded in mystery, often funded by unknown sources. His dealings were never transparent, and he had a reputation for being ruthless in both his business practices and his personal life. "I've heard of him," Westbrook replied, his voice dark. "But he's just a producer. What does he have to do with this?" Lucas's lips curled into something like a smirk. "Blackstone isn't just a producer, Charles. He's the one who controls the real power in this town. The films you make, the projects you manage, they're nothing more than a means to an end for people like him. And you, Charles, you've just stepped into his crosshairs. Westbrook's pulse quickened as he began to piece things together. The strange events, the murders, the cryptic messages, the tension that seemed to follow him like a shadow, were all part of a larger game. But what was the end game? What did Blackstone want from him? And why was he willing to go to such extremes to silence him? You're saying Blackstone is behind the murders? Westbrook asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The thought seemed almost impossible. Blackstone was a powerful figure, yes, but surely he wouldn't go this far. No, Veronica interjected quickly, her voice shaking. Not directly, but his influence runs deep, Charles. His people have been watching you, waiting for the right moment to strike. He's not the one pulling the strings, but he's the one who benefits. Westbrook's mind raced as the implications settled into his bones. He wasn't just facing a lone enemy. He was up against a network of power and deceit that reached into every corner of Hollywood. The murders, the missing film reels, the veiled threats, they were all pieces of a puzzle that he hadn't even begun to understand. But now, with Veronica's confession, the first pieces were starting to fall into place. Who else is involved in this? Westbrook demanded, his voice low but edged with urgency. Who are these people? How far does this go? Veronica's face grew pale and her hand trembled as she clenched the fabric of her dress. I don't know all their names, Charles. But there are others. People who have been part of Blackstone's operation for years. They're the ones who pull the strings behind the scenes. They've been manipulating the industry for decades, using leverage, blackmail, and intimidation to control the direction of films, investments, even careers. Are you telling me that this whole industry is corrupt? Westbrook asked, incredulous. That every producer, every director, every star is just a pawn in some twisted game? No, Lucas interrupted sharply, his voice cutting through the conversation. Not everyone. But enough people are, and the ones who are, control everything. They control what gets made and what gets buried. They control the stories that Hollywood tells the world, and they're willing to do anything to protect that control. The weight of Lucas's words hung heavily in the air, each syllable sinking deeper into Westbrook's consciousness. The reality of the situation was far worse than he had ever imagined. It wasn't just about business. It was about the very essence of power, and how those who wielded it would stop at nothing to maintain their grip. Then why are you telling me this? Westbrook asked, his eyes narrowing. He still didn't fully trust Veronica or Lucas, and he wasn't sure if they were playing him for a fool or if they were telling the truth. What's your angle? Veronica hesitated. Her lips parted as if to speak, but she seemed to struggle with the words. Finally, she took a deep breath and looked at him directly. Because we can't let Blackstone win. Not like this. There was something in her voice, a rawness, a desperation that made Westbrook pause. Veronica Hart had always been an enigma, but there was more to her than the starlit persona she projected. She was tangled up in this web of lies and manipulation, just as much a pawn as he had been. But the fact that she was willing to confess this much told him one thing. She wanted out. Are you telling me you want me to fight back? Westbrook asked, his voice steady but edged with disbelief. Veronica nodded, her eyes glistening with emotion. If we don't stop them, Charles, it'll all come crashing down. They'll ruin everything we've built. And they won't stop until you're out of the picture permanently. Westbrook stood still for a moment, his mind racing. He had fought to get where he was. He had fought tooth and nail to build his empire, and he wasn't about to let anyone, especially not someone like Blackstone, tear it down without a fight. I'm not going down without a fight, he said finally, his voice firm. Lucas's expression remained impassive, but there was a glint of something like approval in his eyes. Good, but you'll need help. You can't do this alone, Charles. Westbrook met his gaze. And you'll help me, won't you? Lucas nodded, though there was something calculating about the way he did it. We'll help. But know this. We're all in this together now. And if we're going to take down Blackstone, we'll have to be smarter than he is. We'll have to outplay him at his own game. Westbrook turned away from them, his mind already formulating a plan. He knew the path ahead would be dangerous and the odds were stacked against him. But he wasn't about to back down, not now. We move quickly, Westbrook said, his voice low but determined. We go after Blackstone's people first. Find out who's working for him, who's loyal to him, and who can be turned. And we take them down one by one. Just be careful, Veronica warned softly, her voice betraying the fear she was trying to suppress. This isn't going to be easy. Blackstone doesn't play by the rules. Westbrook turned to face her, his eyes dark with resolve. Neither do I. With that, they set their plan into motion. The game was no longer about movies or money. It was about survival, and Westbrook would do whatever it took to come out on top. But as the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, Westbrook couldn't shake the feeling that something even darker was lurking just beneath the surface. The true nature of the game, who was really pulling the strings, was still hidden from view, and the closer he got to the truth, the more he realized that the danger he faced wasn't just from the people around him. It was from the very system that had made him who he was. Westbrook paced the length of his office, his thoughts in turmoil. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fall into place, but they were still too scattered, too disjointed. Blackstone's shadow loomed over everything, and though Westbrook had always prided himself on being able to control situations, this was unlike anything he had ever encountered. This was more than a battle for power. It was a fight for his very survival. The room was dimly lit, the soft glow of a desk lamp casting long shadows across the polished wood. He hadn't been able to sleep since the night of the murders. The faces of Tom Reynolds and the second assistant, their lives stolen away so quickly, haunted him. But it wasn't just their deaths that gnawed at him. It was the realization that the very industry he had worked his entire life to dominate was rotten to its core. Westbrook's fingers brushed across the edge of the desk, moving over the papers that still lay there. Contracts, scripts, financials, all the things that had once seemed like the pillars of his success. Now they felt like nothing more than a smokescreen, hiding the dark truth beneath. The door opened behind him, and George stepped in, his face drawn with concern. "Charles, we need to talk." Westbrook turned slowly, his eyes narrowing as he took in George's expression. The man was usually the picture of calm and control, but tonight he looked shaken. "About what?" Westbrook's voice was low, almost dangerous. "About the plan," George said, stepping further into the room. "I've been thinking about what Veronica and Lucas said. If we're going to take on Blackstone, we need to be smart. We can't just go after his people without a strategy. He'll see us coming from a mile away." Westbrook's mind was already working through the possibilities. He had known this wouldn't be easy. He'd known there would be risks. But George was right. This wasn't just a game of one-upmanship. It was a full-fledged war, and Blackstone had been playing it for far longer than Westbrook had realized. "I'm not in the business of playing it safe, George," Westbrook said, his tone hard. "If we don't strike first, we'll lose everything. We need to hit him where it hurts." George hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "I understand. But we can't go in blind. We need intel, and we need leverage. If we don't have something on him, we're just another target." Westbrook looked out the window, his eyes distant. He could feel the weight of everything pressing down on him, the walls closing in. He had spent his life building his empire, but now it felt like everything he had worked for was slipping away. Blackstone's reach was vast, and the people who worked for him were loyal, not because of their admiration for him, but because of the fear he instilled in them. "We'll find leverage," Westbrook said, his voice filled with determination. "I'll start by going after the people closest to Blackstone, those who think they're untouchable. We find their secrets and we use them." George raised an eyebrow. "That's a dangerous game, Charles. Some of those people are just as ruthless as Blackstone. They'll do whatever it takes to protect their position." Westbrook gave a thin smile. "So will I." As George left the room, Westbrook turned back to the papers on his desk. His fingers hovered over the pile of contracts and scripts before him, but his mind wasn't on the business side of things. It was on the people he needed to approach, the deals he needed to make. He had to be careful. One wrong move and he could lose everything. But he wasn't going down without a fight. Not when he was this close. He couldn't afford to wait any longer. The next move had to be made now. The following evening, Westbrook found himself in a quiet, upscale restaurant just off Sunset Boulevard. The kind of place where the elite of Hollywood gathered, hidden from prying eyes, surrounded by velvet curtains and low lighting. He had chosen this location carefully. No one would find them here. As he walked into the private dining room, his eyes scanned the table. At the far end sat a man who had been a key figure in his career, Frank Malone. Malone was a producer, but unlike Blackstone, he had managed to keep his hands clean over the years. He wasn't a saint, but his loyalties, while not as strong as Westbrook would have liked, had always been reliable. "Charles." Frank greeted him with a nod as Westbrook sat across from him, his eyes scanning the room to ensure they were alone. "I wasn't sure you'd show." "I don't have much of a choice," Westbrook replied, his voice low. He leaned forward, locking eyes with Malone. "I need something from you, and I'm willing to pay whatever price it takes." Malone raised an eyebrow. "You've always been a man of business, Charles."
"What's the deal?"
Westbrook slid a manila envelope across the table, and Malone opened it carefully, revealing a stack of photographs. The images showed a high-profile meeting between Blackstone and several other well-known figures in the industry, people who had been considered untouchable. The kind of people who were thought to be too powerful to go down. Malone's eyes flickered over the pictures, and for the first time, a hint of discomfort passed over his face. "You got these from where?" "Doesn't matter where they came from," Westbrook said, his voice firm. "What matters is that Blackstone's hold on this town isn't as secure as he thinks. He's got secrets, and I intend to expose them." Malone looked at him for a long moment, his fingers tapping against the photos. Finally, he nodded. "You're right. Blackstone has been moving pieces around for years, and the way he's been playing people like pawns, well, it's bound to catch up with him. But you need to understand, Charles, he's not the only one with power in this town. If you make a move against him, you're going to make enemies. Powerful enemies." Westbrook's expression didn't change. "I've been making enemies my entire life. That's nothing new. Just be careful," Malone warned. "The kind of people Blackstone deals with aren't just businessmen. They're people who'll use violence, fear, whatever they can to maintain control." "I'm aware of the risks," Westbrook said, "but I'm not backing down. I'll take my chances." Malone hesitated before reaching into his jacket pocket and pulling out a small folded document. He slid it across the table to Westbrook. "If you're serious about this, you'll need this. It's a list of Blackstone's main players, people who think they're untouchable. But trust me, they all have skeletons in their closets." Westbrook glanced down at the list, scanning the names quickly. His mind raced as he saw the connections. Old friends, business associates, people who had helped him in the past. Some of them were closer to Blackstone than he had realized. "Thank you," Westbrook said, his voice thick with determination. "This is the beginning. With this I can start pulling the strings." Malone gave a wry smile. "You're welcome, Charles. But remember, playing this game means you're no longer just a player. You're a target, and once you start going after these people, there's no turning back." Westbrook stood, tucking the list into his jacket pocket. "I don't plan on turning back." Later that night, as Westbrook returned to his office, his thoughts were already focused on the next steps. He would start with the list Malone had provided, the names of Blackstone's most trusted associates. But as he stared out over the city skyline, a sudden creeping feeling washed over him. He wasn't just fighting Blackstone anymore. He was fighting the very system that had built him, and every move he made would only pull him deeper into a web of corruption and danger. For a moment, he allowed himself to think about what might happen if he failed. The consequences were too dire to ignore. Blackstone wasn't just a man. He was a symbol of everything that Westbrook had come to despise about the system he had once been a part of. But that didn't matter. The fight wasn't about Hollywood anymore. It was about survival, and Westbrook would do whatever it took to win. As he sat back in his chair, his mind turned to the next step. He would begin making calls. He would begin turning the screws, pushing his enemies into corners they couldn't escape. And when the time was right, he would strike. But the question remained, who was truly pulling the strings? And when the truth came out, would it be too late to escape the consequences? The storm was coming, and Westbrook was ready to face it head-on. Westbrook stood in front of the full-length window, his eyes locked on the sprawling city below. The soft hum of the city night seemed distant, muffled by the weight of everything that had happened. The game had changed, and he could feel the heat of it closing in. Blackstone's influence stretched further than he had imagined, his tentacles buried deep in the very fabric of Hollywood. Westbrook had once thought himself untouchable, but now he realized he was just another pawn in a much larger game. The list that Malone had given him was now in his hands, the names of those closest to Blackstone, his trusted allies, the ones who helped him weave his web of power. These were the people who would be the first to fall. But as Westbrook sat at his desk, the papers spread before him. A nagging thought began to gnaw at him. Was this really just about the people Blackstone had surrounded himself with? Or was there something more, something deeper, lurking beneath the surface? His hand hovered over the list. It seemed like a straightforward plan. Find Blackstone's key players, expose their secrets, and force them to turn on each other. But the reality of the situation was much more complex. Blackstone wasn't some bumbling criminal. He was a master of manipulation, a man who had built an empire on deception and fear. Any move Westbrook made would be watched, scrutinized, and twisted in ways he couldn't predict. A sharp knock at the door broke his train of thought. "Come in," Westbrook called, his voice betraying none of the tension that was building inside him. The door creaked open and George stepped inside, his expression grave. The moment his eyes met Westbrook's, the air seemed to thicken. "We've got a problem," he said, his voice low, a sense of urgency lacing his words. Westbrook didn't need to ask. He could tell by the look on George's face that this wasn't just another complication. It was something much worse. "What happened?" "Veronica," George replied, his gaze flicking nervously toward the door. "She's gone. She disappeared." Westbrook felt his pulse quicken. Veronica had been a key part of his plan. If she was gone, it could only mean one thing. Blackstone had made his move. "How long?" Westbrook asked, his voice tight with anger and confusion. "Just a few hours ago," George said, his jaw clenched. "I tried to reach her, but no one's answering. I had a contact check her apartment. No sign of her. It's like she vanished." Westbrook stood, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "Damn it," he muttered under his breath. This wasn't just bad luck. This was a calculated move. Blackstone had to know that Veronica was a threat. She had been too involved in everything, too close to the truth. "Do we know where she went?" Westbrook asked, his mind already racing through the possibilities. George shook his head. "I don't think she had time to warn anyone. If she's in trouble, we need to act fast. You know how Blackstone works. He won't hesitate to use her against us." Westbrook paced for a moment, his hands clenched at his sides. Veronica was valuable. She knew too much, and her disappearance meant that Blackstone had either turned her or, worse, decided she was expendable. Either way, it put Westbrook at a severe disadvantage. "We're not waiting around," Westbrook said, his voice cold and calculating. "We need to find her, now." "I'll make some calls," George offered, but Westbrook had already moved past him, heading for the door. "Get in touch with everyone you know," Westbrook ordered, his eyes sharp with focus. "We need to find out where she is. I don't care how, just do it." As George left to follow his instructions, Westbrook stood in the middle of his office, staring at the list in front of him. Veronica's disappearance was a game changer, but it also reinforced the fact that there were no rules in this battle. He had to think differently now. It was no longer just about exposing Blackstone's people. It was about survival. And in this world, survival often meant making alliances with the very people who wanted to see you fail. Westbrook picked up the phone and dialed a number he hadn't thought about in years. The ringing on the other end was answered almost immediately. "Westbrook," a voice on the other end of the line said, its tone clipped and authoritative. "What do you want?" "I need information," Westbrook replied, his voice steady despite the growing sense of urgency. "On Blackstone. Everything you've got." There was a pause on the other end, followed by a soft chuckle. "I should have known you'd come crawling back sooner or later. You always did have a knack for getting yourself into trouble." Westbrook gritted his teeth but kept his tone firm. "This isn't a game, Harris. I need everything. Who Blackstone's working with, who's in his inner circle, where he's hiding, all of it." The voice on the other end of the line sighed, a long, drawn-out sound that spoke volumes of the years of history between the two men. "You've got a hell of a nerve, Charles. But I suppose you wouldn't be calling me if you weren't desperate. Fine, I'll help you. But you owe me. And I don't forget debts." "I'll pay you," Westbrook said, his mind already calculating the cost. He didn't care what it took. He needed information, and Harris was the only one who could give it to him. "Just make it fast, and don't worry, Charles. You'll have it soon enough. But be careful," Harris added, his voice suddenly serious. "You're playing with fire, and Blackstone isn't the only one with a match." The line went dead, leaving Westbrook standing there, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. Harris had never been a friend. They had worked together in the past, their dealings always based on mutual benefit. but trust had never been a part of their relationship. Now Westbrook was forced to rely on him, even though he knew that the man's loyalty could only be bought for a price. Westbrook sat back down at his desk, his mind racing. Veronica's disappearance had put everything into motion faster than he had anticipated. If Blackstone was this ruthless, then he was playing for keeps, and so would Westbrook. The hours passed slowly as Westbrook waited for the call from Harris. Each minute felt like an eternity, the silence of his office pressing in on him. But then, just as he was beginning to lose patience, the phone rang again. It was Harris. "You're in luck," Harris said, his voice more businesslike now. "I've got the information you wanted. Blackstone's key players are as follows: Lucas Darnell, who you already know about, and a man named Jonathan Pierce. He's the one who handles Blackstone's finances. You won't find him in any public records, but he's the one pulling the strings behind the scenes. And then there's Eleanor Cartwright. She's the one who manages Blackstone's connections with the higher-ups in Hollywood, the big-money investors. If you can get to her, you'll have everything you need." Westbrook listened intently, absorbing the names. Jonathan Pierce was a new name, but Eleanor Cartwright was a familiar face. He had crossed paths with her on more than one occasion, always on the periphery of his business dealings. She had a reputation for being cold, calculating, and fiercely loyal to whoever was in charge. If she was involved with Blackstone, that meant he was closer to the heart of the empire than Westbrook had initially realized. "Where can I find them?" Westbrook asked, his mind already racing through the possibilities. "Pierce is always at his private estate in the hills. It's secluded, hard to get to, but not impossible. As for Cartwright, she's meeting with investors at the Skyview Hotel tonight. You'll want to get there before the meeting ends. You won't have much time." Westbrook felt his pulse quicken. This was it. This was the break he needed. With these people in his sights, he could start turning the tide against Blackstone. But he had to move quickly, and he had to be smart. He couldn't afford to make mistakes. "Thank you, Harris," Westbrook said, his voice steady with purpose. "You've done your part. I'll take it from here." Before Harris could respond, Westbrook hung up the phone. His eyes were locked on the list of names in front of him, but now they didn't seem as threatening. He had the upper hand. He knew who Blackstone's key players were. Now he just had to make them talk. It was time to act. Westbrook had waited long enough. Blackstone had underestimated him, thinking that he could be cornered, silenced. But he wasn't going down without a fight. And now, with the pieces of the puzzle finally coming together, Westbrook was ready to make his next move. The game was on, and this time Westbrook would be the one calling the shots. Holmes stood at the front of the room, the tension thick in the air as the final revelation settled on the gathered group. Each suspect seemed a mixture of disbelief, shock, and guilt. Veronica Hart, once the darling of Hollywood, was now revealed as the mastermind behind a carefully plotted conspiracy. A plot that would see her rise to the top while silencing anyone who could threaten her. As the police led Veronica and her accomplices away in handcuffs, Holmes turned to Watson, his face as inscrutable as ever. "Watson," Holmes began, his voice steady, "the allure of fame and fortune often blinds people to the cost of their ambitions. We have witnessed how far people are willing to go to protect themselves, even when it means taking a life. What began as a game of blackmail turned into a tragic tale of murder, all for the sake of a secret that never should have been." Watson, who had been watching the scene unfold with a mix of fascination and sorrow, nodded. "I can't help but think, Holmes, that Hollywood is not as glamorous as it seems. It is as much a world of shadows as it is one of lights. Everyone has their dark secrets. No one is truly innocent." Holmes gave a small, contemplative smile. "Indeed, Watson. The bright lights of Hollywood often cast long shadows, and the more we uncover, the more we realize how much remains hidden from the public eye." Westbrook's murder was merely the tip of the iceberg, and while the case is now closed, it is not the end of the story. People are often willing to go to unimaginable lengths to protect their secrets. With that, Holmes and Watson walked through the doors of the studio, the once glamorous world of Hollywood fading into the distance. The case had been solved, but the darkness they had uncovered stayed with them. Holmes, ever the observer, had seen the true nature of the people involved. For all the glitz and glamour of Tinseltown, it was, at its core, a world built on lies, ambition, and betrayal. As they stepped into the waiting cab, Watson looked out at the illuminated skyline, his thoughts heavy with the moral complexity of the case. "What do you think, Holmes? Did justice truly prevail here?" Holmes turned to him, his gaze thoughtful. Justice, Watson, is a relative concept. We may have caught the criminals behind the murder, but the larger truths, the systemic corruption, the ambition, the manipulation, remain untouched. Hollywood's secrets run far deeper than we could ever hope to uncover. Perhaps that is its true nature, a world of smoke and mirrors, where the truth is the hardest thing to find. Watson fell silent, absorbing Holmes's words as the city's lights flickered in the distance, a reminder of the duality of the world they had just left behind. The case was closed, but the mysteries of the human heart, as ever, remained just out of reach. And so the pair left Hollywood behind, their minds filled with the shadows of its secrets, knowing full well that the world of glamour and deceit they had witnessed would continue long after they had gone. As the cab sped away, the towering figures of Hollywood's movie studios seemed to loom like dark sentinels, guarding their own twisted truths. The glamour had faded, but the shadows it cast would linger untouched forevermore.